You can start.
Okay. Okay, hello everybody. My name is Sébastien Rimbert, and today I'm very happy to present you the work we have done with Fabien Lotte, my supervisor, during my postdoctorate at INRIA Bordeaux Sud-Ouest in France. And this work is about how event-related desynchronization modulations during motor imageries relate to user traits and brain-computer interface performances. So first of all, let's begin with the kinesthetic motor imagery definition. So as you can see on this picture, motor imagery is the ability to imagine performing a movement without executing it. It's a very complex mental task. And in the literature currently, there are two kinds of motor imagery. Visual motor imagery, which is defined as mentally visualizing oneself performing a movement, and kinesthetic motor imagery, which correspond to be more focused on haptic sensations. So for example, proprioceptive, tactile, and kinesthetic sensation felt during the real movement. And today we know that if you imagine a movement, observe an action, or perform a real movement, you will have a very similar activation at the cerebral level. And this is because the three motor tasks share common neural network, and especially at the sensory motor areas. And we also know that kinesthetic motor imagery activates the primary motor cortex and the additional motor areas. And it's why it's a very interesting mental task, especially for stroke rehabilitation, for example, or improvement of sports athletes. So in fact, as you can see on this picture, we have, during a kinesthetic motor imagery of the right hand, you have a contralateral activation of the motor cortex, and while if you perform the mental task with the left hand, you will have an activation at the other hemisphere. So these motor patterns are called ERD and ERS. ERD for event-related desynchronization and ERS for event-related synchronization. These motor patterns were introduced by Fulcheller in 90s, and basically during a motor task you have a decrease of power, mainly in the mu and beta bands, and after the end of the motor task you will have a regain of power called beta rebound, because it appears mainly in the beta band, or ERS for event-related synchronization. And interestingly, these kind of motor patterns are very robust, and they also appear during and after a kinesthetic motor imagery. So I imagine that a lot of people here know what is a brain-computer interface, but just in case, this is the loop of BCI, and the ERD and the ERS pattern can be used to design a new kind of brain-computer interface based on motor cerebral activity. And for example, we can have many applications, so stroke rehabilitation, control, or improvement for sports athletes. So the problematic in the BCI domain now is to improve the BCI performances and to have lower variability from the EEG data. So we all remember the Allison papers about the fact that between 15 and 30% of people are unable to control a BCI. And we think that the relationship between the ERD and the ERS modulations and user personality, but also with experimental BCI context, are still not well understood. And some interesting paper reported previously some correlation between BCI performances and psychology questionnaire measuring user traits. So it's the case, for example, for the MEQRS, the CAVI-IQ questionnaire, and the 16PF5 questionnaire. But also some correlation with BCI performances on some user skills, like meditation skills or manual activity frequency declared by the participant. So, but the problem is there are a lot of lack of knowledge about this topic, and a lot of papers contradict each other. So we believe that this lack of knowledge about the ERD and the ERS modulation limits the possibility to improve BCI performances. So the goal of this study is to understand how ERD and DRS are modulated depending of three things. The first one is the nature of the task, so right hand and left hand kinesthetic motor imagery. If you have one or the other task, the activation of the motor cortex will be modified. Second, depending on the session during which the task was performed, so you know that in the BCI experiment, you will have a calibration session with no or with a sham feedback, and an online session with a real feedback. And third, depending on the characteristic of the user, so the question is, So the question is, can we correlate user information with ERD modulation and BCI performances? So for this study, we analyzed a large database from INRIA Bordeaux with 75 subjects. The participants performed right-hand and left-hand kinesthetic motor imagery during both calibration and user training session. During the calibration session, the participants have sham feedback, and during user training session, real online feedback. And we use the GRASS training BCI protocol. So concretely, there was a red arrow given to the participant to know exactly when he has to perform the kinesthetic motor imagery task, and a continuous feedback was given with a blue bar. And before the experiment, the participant filled a lot of questionnaire about general information, so like age, gender, manual frequency activity, level of study of the participant, and the 16 PF5 questionnaire was about the personality traits of the user. So concerning the results, we compute the topographic map of ERD and DRS for both task and session. So here we can see the contralateral ERD during the left hand and right hand kinesthetic motor imagery for the calibration session, so with a sham feedback. And for user training session, we can see that we have contralateral ERD, but the ERD is stronger and larger during this training session, so with real feedback. And it's pretty logical because the real feedback was helpful for the subject, so maybe it can improve the kinesthetic motor imagery practice. And we also compute the ERD modulation during the time window of 5 seconds. So here we can see that the difference we have between the user training session and calibration session is more focused about the end of the motor imagery task, and it appears that the real feedback for the user the participant with the real feedback is able to sustain the kinesthetic motor imagery at the end of the task. So now we have the time frequency analysis for both sessions, and here we can see that we have an ERD mainly in the mu band, but also in the beta band, and the ERS is a little bit weak. But for user training session, we have an ERD stronger in the mu band and beta band, and the presence of ERS after the task. Concerning the correlation result, first we compute correlation between ERD modulation and BCI performances, and we found that ERD modulation is negatively correlated with BCI performances. It's pretty logical because it means that more is the decrease of the power, so more you have ERD, better is your BCI performances. And second, we compute ERD modulation with user characteristics, and now we found no correlation with general information from the user, so for example age, experimenter gender or user gender, level of study of the participant, and manual activity frequency. There was no correlation. But we found one interesting correlation between the self-control item from the 16 PF5 questionnaire, and it means that if you have a better self-control, your ERD is lower. So it means that more you have self-control, so less you are letting go during the task, less you have ERD modulation. And finally, we found no correlation between BCI performances and user characteristics. So to conclude, we found a strong correlation between BCI performances and ERD modulation. It's in adequation with the literature of the domain. Most of the publications found this kind of correlation. We found no correlation between BCI performances, ERD modulations, and manual frequency activity declared by the participants. And it's the opposite we found for another experiment, but with a different BCI paradigm, a paradigm based on right hand versus resting state and not right hand versus left hand kinesthetic motor imagery. And we found no correlation of BCI performances on the ERD modulation with gender. And one article recently published by Alima Dani found that there was one, a little bit, but they use a different compute of ERD. They use a mu suppression score to correlate with gender, and it's not the case in this study. And we found the positive correlation between self-control from the 16 PF5 questionnaire and the ERD modulation. So it means that people who are not able to letting go during the task may have a lower ERD. And for perspective, we want to do future analysis with the ERS modulation and not only with the ERD, and explore if there is a correlation between the variability of ERD and ERS response over different trials and some user traits. And finally, maybe design a model of ERD and ERS modulation based on BCI session, on task, on user characteristic to predict in advance the generation of ERD and maybe help some bad user to perform with the BCI. So thank you for my co-author and supervisor Fabien Lotte, and thank you for my amazing POTIOC team at IEEE Bordeaux Sud-Ouest. Thank you for your attention.